Today, I will show you the most amazing automation best practices to help you succeed in test automation, all while taking a bad test and turning it into an amazing one through a refactoring process. These are the best practices that myself and a team of solution architects have used to create amazing test automation. Between the 7 of us, we have over 75 years of test automation experience. We've also used these test automation practices with hundreds of clients to help them achieve their goals. So stay tuned as I take you step by step from a poorly written test to one that can run in parallel, is cross-browser, autonomous, and extremely reliable. Let's go. After completing this course, you'll be able to write top quality tests, run tests in parallel, create proper page objects, and you'll master synchronization, all the important automation best practices to have extremely reliable test automation. Just a little bit about myself. My name is Nikolay. I am a solutions architect from Sauce Labs. All that ultimately means is that I'm an SDET with a bunch of test automation experience. I've worked from small companies to really large companies. I've even started working with tools such as IBM Rational Robot and HP QTP, if anyone is familiar with that. In fact, I even remember when Mercury Interactive was around, and then I transitioned into Selenium and the whole open source community. So I've been doing test automation for a really long time, and on the weekends, I enjoy to do more test automation, which is why I started my blog, ultimateqa.com, where I've been teaching test automation since about 2013. And ultimately, don't forget that I am an animal lover, so that means that all of my opinions are absolute facts. There are some rules of engagement. Number 1, don't worry about making any kind of mistakes. This will be an interactive video, and I'm going to ask you to think and do stuff on your own, and don't be afraid to make mistakes. We all make mistakes. I make mistakes every single day. The important part is to learn from them. We either win or we learn. And participation is strongly encouraged. A lot of times these videos are extremely boring, and I'm going to make it interactive because I want you to be doing stuff. I want you to be practicing and putting the knowledge in your head and in your keyboard rather than on a piece of paper or just by watching it. So let's get into it. The very first thing that we have to talk about is the automation pyramid. Some of you may not be familiar with the automation pyramid, others may be. I still encounter people that are not familiar with it, so we have to talk about it. The automation pyramid is an idea that was originally created by Mike Cohn in about 2004. There's some records of him presenting the automation pyramid at a conference in around 2004, although it wasn't formally added to a book Succeeding in Agile until 2009. Anyways, this automation pyramid creates the idea of how we should think about our test automation and how our test automation should be distributed. At the very bottom layer, you'll see the unit layer, and at the very top layer, you'll see the UI layer. And every layer, you should have tests that are decreasing in size. So for example, the unit layer will have the most amount of tests, then at the service layer will have less tests than that, and at the UI layer will have the least amount of tests of all. And the reason for that is actually pretty simple. Unit tests are the fastest types of tests to execute, and they are the cheapest types of tests to write. Unit tests execute in milliseconds. Some unit tests can execute in 1 to 5 milliseconds. UI tests, on the other hand, execute in seconds to minutes. Right? That's thousands of times slower than unit tests. So that is one of the reasons why we want to be trying to follow the automation pyramid and using it as a guide for all test automation that we do, including UI automation. There's this other test automation pyramid that I find extremely interesting because it was created by Jason Huggins. If you're not familiar with Jason Huggins, he was the creator of Selenium. He created Selenium in 2004, and he also did this drawing of this automation pyramid, but he was comparing it to the food pyramid. At the very bottom layer, he had unit tests, right? You said lots and lots of those, like the vegetables and the fruits that we should be eating. And at the very top, he put the salts and the fats, and he said use sparingly. Those are the UI tests. So to me, it's just kind of interesting, a moment in history showing this, that the creator of Selenium is encouraging us to follow this pyramid so that we can actually succeed in test automation. And the other reason that I'm talking about the automation pyramid is that this is the fundamental concept of test automation. You need all the layers in the automation pyramid in order to succeed. You can't have just UI tests and you can't have just unit tests. All the layers work together to create a 100% coverage matrix of your software. So remember that you can't just succeed with UI automation, for example, and you can't just succeed with unit testing. They all have to work together. And every time we think about a test, we have to think about where in the pyramid does this test case belong. So with that said, I want to play a little game. Again, I told you this is going to be interactive and I want to encourage participation. So we're going to be testing this web application here. You can see the URL over there, automation in testing.online. This is just a sample booking website. It's open source. It has a backend and a front end, which is perfect for our testing needs because most applications these days are built exactly like this. And we're going to be writing automated tests for it in the meantime. So I showed you the application that we're testing, and now I want to show you a flow diagram of how this application behaves. In fact, most of the applications in the world today behave similar to this application. Most applications in the world have a presentation layer, they have a middle layer, and then they have the back end where all the code runs and all the data is stored. And so in our situation, if we're looking at this event diagram, what you'll notice is that we have a login flow. Our login flow starts at the UI phase where the page is loaded. And then once the page is loaded, you can see there's some JavaScript that executes, and then you interact with the login through the UI, right? The login sends an API request that gets processed. The credentials are checked, and then an API response is sent back. Based on the response, the appropriate stuff is rendered in the UI, and then something is or is not visible. That is our application. That is how it behaves. Keep this in mind. It's going to be very important. And now, with that said, I want to play this game where we're going to decide where each of these tests belongs in the pyramid. Now, they're our requirements, but ultimately what's going to happen is we're going to pretend to automate, right? Whether we're testing manually or through automation, ultimately this whole presentation is about automation. So we're going to be deciding where in the automation pyramid will we be performing these test cases. So that was for that form that you saw before. Now, the very first test case that we want to test is that the name field cannot be left blank. Where in the automation pyramid would we automate such a test case? In the unit layer, the API layer, or the UI layer? Take a moment, think about it, write your answer down, and I'll revisit it in a second. So the name field cannot be left blank, should be done at the unit layer. The reason for that is because, again, we're talking about creating the most efficient test automation that we can, right? Writing automation at a place where it should be written. So a unit test, if it's the cheapest to write, the fastest to execute, and the most stable, that is where we want to perform the test, unless for some reason it's impossible. And why won't this happen in the UI? Why is this something that we don't want to perform in the UI? Well, let's go take a look at the actual application. This application, the reason why I picked it is because it's a very standard application. It's one that has a UI where we do stuff, right? Where we fill out the form or whether we log in, it doesn't matter what we're actually performing. But it has a front end that displays all the information, and then the back end processes all the logic and comes back with a response. So, for example, if we don't supply a name here, but we supply everything else, right? Let's supply this fake email. Let's supply this fake phone. Let's put a subject line and then let's put some message in here. What I would like for you to see is when I click this submit button, a request is sent to the backend. So watch. See how this appeared? A request was sent to the backend and I got a 400 error message. So if we're testing that the name cannot be blank, this error message tells us everything here. So look, we got a 400 response. And you see here is the payload that we sent with all of the test data. And the reason we got a 400 response is because the name was blank. And so our real test case is send a web request with the data. And then if the data is valid, return a proper error code. If not, return a different error code. And so that can be done at the unit layer, because at the unit layer, you can just have an object that has all of this information in here. And then when that information is sent, it should return some status code, like a 400 status code that tells us that the name is required. That is why you can test that at the unit layer. You don't need to test it at the UI layer, because all the UI layer does is take this information and put it into the payload body. It doesn't actually have any validation here. All the validation occurs because of that web request that is sent. And again, the web request is happening at the API layer, and we can even take it down to the unit layer where all the logic is actually happening. And so that's why we don't need to do that test any higher than the API layer. Now, a lot of us as automation engineers, we don't operate at the unit layer. Now, it's strongly recommended that you work with your developers to implement this test, and then you don't have duplicate coverage in other layers. But if you don't have unit tests, you can move this test to the API layer, as I already showed you, because ultimately the API is what sends the JSON body with a web request, and then the web request will come back with a 400 and an appropriate error message if you want to implement that, to let us know that the name field cannot be left blank. So unit layer or API layer, certainly not the UI layer, unless there's actual JavaScript validation occurring at the UI layer, which would be a huge security problem. This test should never be done at the UI layer. Now, next test case. Where are we going to automate it? The subject field must be between 5 and 100 characters. So again, read that. Think about your answer. Where in the automation pyramid will we perform such a test case? And then when you come back, I'll tell you where it belongs. So this test case, hopefully now a little bit easier once you understand the application, should come as no surprise it belongs at the unit layer. The reason it belongs at the unit layer is because, again, in our application, we have some code where the field is filled out and the field has some characters in it. And those characters are sent via a web request. The web request sends it to the back end where we have our application running. The application takes that subject field data and analyzes it to see, is it between 5 and 100 characters? If not, return the appropriate response. But ultimately, you can do the same exact thing by simply writing a unit test. You can write a test that sends in a subject field that's less than 5 characters, that's more than 100 characters, and make sure that the function returns you the appropriate result. Let's go take a look at our application for you to better understand. So here we are back at our application. Let's actually go ahead and implement the field now. So here we are back at our application. Let's actually go ahead and implement the field now, the name field. Okay, and so we want to make sure that the subject field is between 0 to 100 characters. So let's put 4 here, which is an excellent boundary test case, boundary testing. And now if we send this request by pushing the submit button, all the submit button does is send a request here. submit. And so you can see it sent a message. Again, we got a 400 status code because it's not allowed. Yes, we get this error message here, but ultimately this error message displaying came from the back end that told us that this field is not long enough. Look, we can again open this up and we can look at the body of this object. If you scroll down here, you can see here's the request payload. It supplied all this information, and you can see that the subject has these numbers in it, and then there's a function in the back end that validates how many characters is this subject line. Again, can be performed at the unit layer. If you don't have unit developers writing unit tests, then as an automation tester, you have to take it on upon yourself to do it at the API layer. And at the API layer, all you would do is generate a similar payload, right? You would have a similar JSON that has this kind of information, and then you would send a post that would try, you can see you send the post over here to this URL, and then you would expect it to give you back a 400 error message, because that should not be allowed. And then if your web request returns an error message, you can also expect an appropriate error message from that web request. So hope that makes sense. Again, unit layer is the most preferable. Your developer should be writing unit tests for that. If not, you got the API layer. Absolutely should not be happening at the UI layer. The UI layer doesn't do anything with this logic. It's too slow, too flaky. You don't need to do it at the UI layer. API layer at the worst case. Next, the page displays form requirements criteria. Think about where that test case belongs. How would you test it? Through automation. Where in the pyramid it belongs, and when you come back, I'm going to tell you the answer. Finally, we have a test case being done at the UI layer, because the UI layer is the presentation layer. It shows us which requirements criteria we must have. And so, as you already saw, when we sent an invalid request, it tells us the problem with our request and how we can fix it. And if we send a valid request, it doesn't tell us anything. Let's actually send a valid request so that you can see that. And actually, we'll do that with the next test case. So hopefully you got that right. That one is pretty simple. There's no way you can validate the rendering of an HTML page at the unit or the API layer, because those are just services. The rendering of the actual page happens in the UI. Next test case. Form submits successfully with valid information. How would you validate that a form successfully submits when you enter valid information? Think about that. I'll write that down. When you come back, we'll figure it out. All right. So this one, I put that you can do it at the API layer. The reason why you can do it at the API layer is because, again, you can fill out all the information and you can submit the form using just a web request. And so when you send that web request, that will return you the appropriate response, which should be like a 200 status code, meaning that the HTTP response was valid. And that will tell us that the form works when we enter all the positive criteria. Let's go take a look at that. So let's enter all proper criteria here. Let's make this here, and let's enter a valid email. Okay, great. And then this message. Great. And let's send the proper web request. Let's clear all this. And see that? Perfect. So it returned a 200 status code, meaning that it was a post, 200 meaning that everything was good. And it also loaded up this new page where we can see this room that we can, I guess, book. And so you can even see here, there is UI validations, but those UI validations are only coming from the API validations. The API drives what the UI renders, basically. And so that's what we want to understand here. So this test could potentially be performed at the unit layer as well, because all you need to do, right, is to have an object that has all those properties for the JSON body, and then send that object into your method and make sure that the method returns the appropriate response, whatever handles the all the valid information for the fields. The reason why I put it at the API layer is because submitting of the form, we wanted to test at the API layer because the API connects the UI layer and the unit layer, and so ultimately clicking that button, that submit form button, triggers the API, and so we wanted to test that the API is working properly as well, that the API is properly integrated with the actual application layer. So that's why I put it at the API layer. You could potentially do both. You can perform a check at both of the layers, and then when you're performing it at the API layer, you are also testing the integration between your API and your application. So the final test case here, form cannot be submitted with invalid entries. This one you should already know based on all the exercises we've done, that it belongs at the API layer as well. Could potentially be done at the unit layer, but the reason I'm putting it at the API layer is because I want to test the integration with the API and our back end, make sure that they're connected together and working properly. So these are all the test cases. What do I want you to take away from this? Why did I do this entire exercise? The reason why I wanted to do this entire exercise is I find that over and over, whenever we help our clients in test automation, it is rarely the tooling that gets individuals in trouble. Most of the time, 99% of the time, it's not the tooling, it's not applying the automation pyramid to test automation to make it easier. I can't tell you the number of times I've seen UI automation being done on a login form, testing valid and invalid credentials into a login form in the UI. That doesn't, as I already told you, that doesn't need to happen in the UI. Majority of our applications behave exactly as the one that I showed you. That should be an API test or even a unit test. Both of those layers would test that those test cases more efficiently, faster, and will cost the company way less money in the long term and even in the short term. So that I want you to be thinking about every single test case that you're writing from this point forward and thinking about where in the automation pyramid can I place this test case to make it more efficient. As automation engineers, it's our job to write tests at the UI layer and the API layer, and then it's also our job as professionals working in a team to deliver highest quality software to work with the developers to write the appropriate unit tests, make sure that those unit tests are testing the appropriate stuff so that we're not duplicating their logic, and ultimately providing faster feedback and higher quality software.